A major concern with capital punishment is whether race is having an impact on the administration of the death penalty. In 1987, a significant case came to the U.S. Supreme Court that raised that exact issue. In McCleskey versus Kemp, a case out of Georgia, McCleskey relied on a significant study that was performed by a law professor and a group of researchers. The law professor's name was David Baldus, and the study was named after him. So the Baldus study refers to this major study that was carried out in Georgia in which all murders since 1976, since the implementation of new death penalty procedures was upheld as constitutional. The Baldus study studied all murders that had occurred since that period, and they tried to determine what factors influenced the administration of the death penalty in Georgia. What they found was that race did play a significant role, but it wasn't just the race of the offender, it was the race of the offender in combination with the race of the victim. And so just focusing on blacks and whites, you can see in this chart that in terms of actual death sentences that were handed out, we can see one, before we get into the actual racial combinations, that the death penalty was a sentence in a minority of the cases. Even if you look at the highest category, the 22% category, that still meant that 78% of people in this category did not get the death penalty. So what does that say about America and the death penalty? Does it say that maybe if we're asked generally about the death penalty, Americans might say that they're in favor of it, but when they actually had to sit on a death penalty jury and decide a person's fate, they're more likely to vote for mercy than for death? That may be what this chart is telling us overall. But if we look at the specific issue that was at stake in McCleskey versus Kemp, does race matter? This chart seems to say that it does. So if we look, for instance, at the chart, we see that the most punished combination is a black murderer and a white victim. 22% of the time, this racial combination results in the death penalty. Whereas if you're a black murderer and you kill a black victim, so your race hasn't changed, you're the same race in either circumstance, it's a black murderer. But if your victim's race changes, if you kill someone who's black, you're only going to get the death penalty 1% of the time. So this is the category, this is the combination that has the lowest rate of death penalty verdicts. If you're white and you kill someone who's black, it's 3% of the time there's a death verdict. And if you're white and kill someone who's white, it's 8% of the time. So those numbers are a little closer. But this extreme variance for black murderers, based on the race of their victim, according to Baldus, says something. One, it told them when they did all the stats, and they made everything as statistically valid and reliable as possible. What they found was that knowing the racial combination of victim and murderer, you could predict whether the person received a death sentence with as much certainty as knowing that the person had a prior murder conviction. Now that's pretty significant. The fact that a prior murder conviction was only as relevant as the person's racial combination, that seems to say that race is still playing a major factor in the administration of the death penalty. Especially when we look at these numbers in light of history, they're not coming out of left field. We have traditionally in American society punished black on white crime most severely and black on black crime least severely. If this may be because the police don't investigate as thoroughly, maybe this community doesn't cooperate as thoroughly either when we have black on black crime as black on white. But again, do the police take the crime as seriously? Does the prosecutor put as many resources into black on black murders as black on white? And so on and so forth. So we've had a tradition throughout our history of punishing black on white crime more severely than black on black. So, just look in literature, consider a book like To Kill a Mockingbird. A black man who's accused of rape, we're going to punish that offense more severely than perhaps a white man who rapes a white woman. So crossing racial barriers in a certain way is more likely to cause a more severe punishment than intra-racial um, crimes, especially if we're dealing with black crimes. So is that telling us that maybe somehow white victims matter more, and especially white victims of black murderers, than black victims? That's something I'll leave you to answer for yourself. The court didn't answer that. The court also looked at, given in the study, was the prosecutor's decision to seek death. So this is obviously a key decision. Will the prosecutor even seek the death penalty? And so maybe it's not the jury that's problematic, maybe it's the prosecutor, because if we look at this chart, again, the previous chart that we just looked at were actual death verdicts given by the jury. This one is a chart showing the rate at which the prosecutors sought the death penalty. And we see a similar kind of breakdown, where if it's black on white crime, 70% of the time. This is the only category where the prosecution sought the death penalty in a majority of cases, but black on white victims, 70% of the time the prosecutor sought the death penalty. So even when we have white murderers killing white victims, it's only 32% of the time. So it's over double the rate when we have a black murderer and a white victim. Like we saw in the last chart, the lowest rate was with a black murderer and a black victim. Only 15% of the time did the prosecutor even seek the death penalty. So if the prosecutor is only seeking the death penalty in a small minority of cases with black murderers and black victims, it's not surprising that the jury is coming back with very few death verdicts. They're getting very few death penalty cases. Whereas for white victims, we'd expect a higher rate because the prosecutor is seeking the death penalty so much more often. So maybe the problem is with the prosecutor, not with the jury. When all this evidence, all this data was given to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, these are just showing acceptable discrepancies. So it was a close decision, but a majority of the court said, this is close enough. Okay, we recognize that there are differences, but with any human endeavor, there are going to be some differences. Well, those are pretty significant differences. Again, the researchers concluded that race played as significant a role as a prior murder conviction, something that we think the jury should be considering. They should be considering prior murder convictions. They shouldn't be considering race. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court rejected those arguments. The Supreme Court instead said, McCluskey, even if this data could be taken as true, nonetheless, you have to show in your specific case that there was discrimination. Because McCluskey was black, his victim was white, show us that you were actually discriminated upon because of this. Even though the data would suggest it was likely that he was, it's going to be nearly impossible for him to show that there was such discrimination, unless we have the jury coming out of the deliberations and saying, we did it, yes, we considered his race, how are you going to prove that? So the Supreme Court made it almost impossible to show racial bias and to prove racial bias to a degree that would cause the death penalty to be struck down. The Supreme Court also said that the Gregg decision was meant to restrain juries, not prosecutors, so they wouldn't even really consider the prosecutor data. They said, well, that's prosecutorial discretion, we're not going to go into that. Gregg was only concerned about arbitrariness for the jury. Prosecutors, we're not going to worry about you. And so maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's really what they more or less said. We're only going to consider whether the jury was sufficiently restricted to consider the evidence, or and we're not even going to consider whether we should apply the same standards to prosecutors. So as a result, the Supreme Court found that McCluskey's sentence was constitutional, and he was eventually executed. I think the Supreme Court was, even though they didn't say it, they were fearful that if they said that there was bias with the death penalty, they'd probably have to say it for the rest of the system too, because I think we'd find similar bias throughout the rest of the system. By refusing to recognize the data and what the data seemed to be showing, the Supreme Court was able to keep essentially the status quo of the system, even if it was keeping discrimination as part of the system. The boldest study has been replicated in other states, including Pennsylvania, and they've found similar results of bias. In Pennsylvania, they even found worse bias. But nonetheless, again, that study wasn't sufficient to cause the Supreme Court to overturn McCluskey's death sentence. It was found to be constitutional. In Pennsylvania, however, these studies do have had an impact. Pennsylvania's Governor Wolf, has declared a moratorium because of concerns about racial bias in the administration of the death penalty, so there can be no executions carried out until another study is completed, and there are Penn State crim professors who are conducting some of that research, and their results should be done. Their study should be done pretty soon, and they can report the results. What will happen afterwards, I can't tell you. Will the legislature respond by getting rid of the death penalty in Pennsylvania? We don't execute anybody here in Pennsylvania. We've executed 3 people since 1976. All of those voluntarily went to their death. We've never executed anyone since the re-establishment of the death penalty who has not gone willingly to their death. Everybody who's we've tried to execute against their will has had their appeals upheld and a stay of execution. So, do we really have the death penalty in Pennsylvania? Well, there are people sitting on death row, but we don't carry it out. So some may question whether we actually do have the death penalty. Well, we do. Will the death penalty resume after this new study is done in Pennsylvania? Well, I know some of the researchers, and they're finding that there is bias still remaining. So my guess is the moratorium will continue, and there won't be executions in Pennsylvania. As a little bit of other additional information related to the death penalty, if an execution is carried out in Pennsylvania, it will occur not far from Penn State campus. Uh, by law, all executions have to be carried out at Rockview, which is just past the Nittany Mall near Penn State, near State College. Death row is in different prisons. It's in SCI Green, which is south of Pittsburgh, and SCI Graterford, which is in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. But executions, if they resume, will be carried out at Rockview, right here near Penn State.